Okay, good morning, everyone, the speakers and the delegates. I welcome everyone on the behalf of MOS and BOA for this academic feast on pediatric ophthalmology and strabismus on this bright Sunday morning. We are happy to have Dr. Subhash Dadia as the chairperson for this session, and he's a professor at Guru Nanak Eye Center and the president of DOS and a co-opted member of SPOCI. And Dr. Prasad Valimbe as the co-chairperson who is a private practitioner in Pune. So now I ask Dr. Hemlata to take over.
Yeah, good morning, everyone. Welcome to the session on pediatric ophthalmology and strabismus. Our first speaker is Dr. Uday Naik, who is director of Navtej Netralaya, and he would be speaking to us on topical squint surgery. Dr. Uday Naik, please.
Hi, good morning all. Am I audible?
Yes, audible.
Yes, you are audible.
Loud and clear.
Oh, okay, thank you, sir. First of all, at the outset, I would like to thank Scientific Committee BOA for giving me this opportunity, and heartiest congratulations that you are so professional that we are starting on dot 9 a.m. So I am a opening batsman, and I would be talking on topical squint surgery. पुढे जात नाही शीतल. My slides are moving.
Take the arrow, click on the arrow.
Yeah, arrow only. Okay. So no financial interest. To begin with, a glass of wine and a good lunch, followed by a headlock and a quick surgeon were early day anesthesia. And this is how the squint surgery was started centuries before. So I am presenting nothing which is new. So this is a 21-year-old female who had history of squint surgery done her in left eye in her childhood. Hello. Her vision is 6/6 and 6 in both eyes, and she has 40 prisms of exotropia with minimum left hypertropia associated with left eye inferior oblique overaction. Her distant angles were more than near even after patch test. So I had planned both eyes squint surgeries in the form of both eyes lateral rectus recession of 8 mm and left eye inferior oblique weakening procedure. As the left eye was a resurgery eye, I had planned it under local anesthesia, and the right eye was planned under topical anesthesia. So for topical anesthesia is given with the help of 2% xylocaine jelly, which is inserted 15 minutes prior the starting of surgery. After that, the anesthesia is achieved with topical proparacaine 0.5% drops, which are put 2 to 3 times at 5 minutes of interval. To guard against the oculocardiac reflex, as you all know, we give injection atropine 0.4 milligram intramuscularly before the surgery, and throughout the procedure, pulse rate is monitored. So I am directly going to the video of this surgery. The patient is asked to look in extreme opposite direction of gaze in which the muscle which you are operated, like adduction in this case. Before touching conjunctiva, it is better to put a drop of paracaine and then touch the conjunctiva. The change here in incision is taken over the muscle. And to know that thing, topical brimonidine eye drops can be put just before starting the surgery, so that conjunctiva is blanched and we can see the brownish muscle mass clearly, so that we can plan our incision accordingly. Then next important thing is to hook. The hooking is always done very gently, as the muscles are having stretch receptors and any pulling would cause pain. So always it is better to hook muscles very gently. So there should not be any pulling while you do topical squint surgery. Then you can continue with your routine procedures like steps like half thickness muscle suture, then followed by full thickness one. That is, all those steps are very regular one. Even you can use Moody's forceps to fix the globe in this case. As soon as we cut or disinsert the muscle, the pain completely goes off, and patient is better as regards to pain after this step of cutting or disinserting. One important thing in topical anesthesia is like you have to give continuously vocal local anesthesia. That means you continuously keep on going talking with the patient, so that the patient's cooperation goes on increasing as the time passes by. We can give live commentary of the surgery as regards in what stage of surgery you already are going, how much time it will require to finish the job, how the patient is responding, how is he or she is feeling, whether she is having any pain. All such questionnaire you can go on doing, so that patient is more involved with you rather than in her pain, in her or his pain. So continuous vocal local is important, and this is the very important step. Like when we take scleral sutures, everything should be meticulous, as this is really a very ideal bite that throughout the pass the needle is visible. Here the new insertion site is exactly of the same size as the original insertion site. So here the muscle is reattached to the sclera exactly 8 millimeter from the original insertion, and muscle and the 6/0 vicryl suture knots are being taken. Surprisingly, we may think that maybe doing topical anesthesia, the surgical time will be more, but it is not. Actually, in this case, usually I take only 15 minutes for my one muscle. And in this case, also the time taken was just 17 minutes. So this is the new insertion. And after that, we close with interrupted suture. I feel that is better in topical anesthesia squint surgery, because we can put topical Paraken drops before touching the conjunctiva and take the sutures. So this is how it finishes the surgery. Now this is immediately after the surgery. As you can see the microscope behind, the patient is very comfortable moving her eyes, and the next picture is of 1 day post-op. So topical squint surgeries requirements, I would say that there should be motivated surgeon and equally motivated patient. Equally fast surgeon would be more exercising this option of is hallmark, but there is no difference as such between cooperation from a male or a female. Anesthesiologist with a secured IV line is a must. And if you have your routine good seasoned assistant alongside you, it will be icing on the cake. But if it is not possible, don't lose your heart. Anesthesia at any point of time. So which muscles and which surgeries? Usually recti are preferred over the obliques. I personally have not operated any oblique under topical anesthesia. I know Dr. Santhan Gopal sir. Okay, yeah. The simplest muscle to operate on is lateral rectus. Recession surgeries are more simpler than resections, although tenotomy's advancement and Fedden sutures have been done under topical. Topical surgery gives us opportunity to do on-table adjustments, so we can achieve more perfect results, and there are no issues associated with injection and GA. But this is restricted or limited only to a special subgroup of patients, surgeries, and surgeons. Oculocardiac reflex is a constant risk, and sometimes we have to change the anesthesia. Literature is robust with proponents of topical anesthesia surgeries. So to take home, topical squint surgery is very much doable. Proper delicate handling and continuous vocal local is key to success. Standby anesthesiologist is must. On-table assessments and adjustments are possible, so we can achieve more perfect results and more smiles like this. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Uday, for that wonderful video demonstration of topical surgery. Now I invite Dr. Rishikesh Mai to speak about incisions in squint surgery.
Am I audible?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, I'm just sharing my screen. At the outset, I would like to thank Bombay Ophthalmic Association and Maharashtra Ophthalmic Association for such a wonderful academic session and allowing me to be a part of this scientific deliberation. So the topic of my presentation is incisions in squint surgery. Like all surgeries in medical science, incision is vital even in squint surgery, and choosing the correct incision size and site gives a good surgical exposure. It simplifies the surgical maneuvers. It reduces the post-operative irritation and provides better post-operative cosmesis. One more point which we can add here is that if resurgery is contemplated later on, and if you have a good incision initially, perhaps we can use the same incision site for resurgery as and when required. So the aim of this presentation is to discuss the advantages and disadvantages of various incisions in squint surgery. There is nothing like one rule fits all. Different surgeons, they use different types of incision for similar surgical procedure based upon their experience, comfort, and also the patient profile. So basically there are three types of incisions we use for squint surgery. One is the limbal or Harm's incision. One is a paralimbal. Swan is basically a type of paralimbal incision, and fornicial incision or Park's incision. Coming to limbal incision or Harm's incision, here basically just a diagram to show how it is done. We give the first incision paralimbally so that one blade of the scissor can pass in the subtenon space. The advantage of limbal incision is that at the limbus, the conjunctiva and the tenons are attached together. So we need a single incision, and tenons might not trouble us there, as it might in a paralimbal or a fornicial incision. After doing the limbal incision, we can give radial cuts so as inadvertent conjunctival tear will not happen. Some surgeons for two horizontal recti also use a single limbal incision like a 270 degrees peritomy.
Dr. Rishi, sorry, could you be a little more audible? Not able to hear.
Am I audible now?
Yeah.
Okay. So then I will just share a small video. This is actually an older video because I don't tend to use the limbal incision nowadays. Basically, we have to do the first incision paralimbally so that one blade of the scissor can pass underneath the subtenon space, and then you do a radial cuts to it, and then followed by hooking the muscle. The advantage of limbal incision is that we see most of the structures, any inadvertent cutting of any muscle tissue or ciliary vessel is usually not there. It is easier to learn and better. So in the initial phase of our practice, like when you are learning squint surgery, perhaps this will be the incision of choice. Also for older patients where chances of inadvertent cutting of the conjunctiva or handling of the conjunctiva leading to tearing of the conjunctiva is less. Also, for many of the surgeons for adjustable squint surgery, use limbal incision. The disadvantage is that we need to have a larger incision size, so chances of postoperative irritation, inflammation, corneal delen are more. Also, for limbal procedures like trabeculectomy, it may not be the incision of choice. So, where to use limbal incision is for beginners or trainees, resurgeries, pre-existing extensive conjunctival scarring for any reason, squint surgery or a buccal surgery, we might use this particular incision, and also for elderly age group. Coming to paralimbal incision, these are basically of two types. One is the swan incision like this, where you place the incision over the muscle and then you perform the surgery there. The advantage is that we might need a smaller dissection of the smaller incision size because you are directly approaching the muscle. But the disadvantage is if the surgeon is not well trained, then the chances of cutting the inadvertent cutting of the muscle fibers or the ciliary vessel is there. The other paralimbal incision is placed in between the limbus and the muscle insertion, and then the surgical procedure are performed. Here, the chances of inadvertent cutting of the muscle are lesser, but being closer to the limbus, the chances of postoperative irritation are definitely there. So just a small video about how the paralimbal incision is done. This is in between the limbus and the insertion of the muscle. First, you have to cut the conjunctiva, then go to the tenons, because especially in younger children, younger age group, the tenons might be thick. So we might have to dissect that and then do an undermining of the tenons tissue. And then we approach the muscle or hook the muscle as per the requirement of the surgery. Another incision is the fornix or Park's incision, which is popular among the experienced surgeons. it is in the bulbar conjunctiva of the cul-de-sac in between the two recti muscles, two adjacent recti muscles. You place an incision here and you can approach both the muscles with this. The advantage is that with a single incision, you can approach two muscles, and based upon the requirement of surgery, if you are approaching the recti muscles, you can extend the incision parallel to the fornix, or if you want to approach the obliques, which are more posteriorly placed, so we might have to use a parallel incision. Just a couple of videos to show. This is for the inferior oblique. We usually go in the inferotemporal quadrant, 8 millimeters posterior to the limbus, and then we place the incision here and conjunctiva followed by the tenons. And with a single incision, I can approach three muscles now: the lateral rectus, the inferior rectus, and the inferior oblique. Another video for the superior oblique. This was actually an incision which was placed perpendicular. This patient had already undergone a lateral rectus surgery somewhere else, and he was a case of a Brown syndrome. So we approached superotemporally. As you can see, the fornix-based incision provides hooking the superior rectus, but we have to go in the superior for the superior oblique, which is posterotemporal here. After stabilizing the superior rectus, we realized that the incision may not be adequate for performing the superior oblique. So we can extend the peritomy posteriorly, that is perpendicular to the fornix, and then apply a DMARS retractor and get a proper exposure of the superior oblique muscle. And this helps in getting a proper exposure of the superior oblique here and then hooking the muscle.
So we have a minute.
Yes, I'm just concluding. So advantage of this is that it provides less chances of inadvertent muscle injury because it is placed in between the two muscles, and two neighboring muscles can be approached with this single incision. And also the scar is not noticeable, postoperative irritation is less. However, the disadvantages cannot be, for the beginner, it may not be the incision of choice. And also for elderly age group, the posterior flap of the conjunctiva might not be retrievable later on. Just a word about minimally invasive strabismus surgery, or MIS. It's a newer technique which provides a small incision size. Usually, if you are beginning with this, the usual age group is 14 to 40 years. What is done is we perform multiple keyhole incisions close to the muscle of interest. And depending upon the tightness of the muscle or the thickness of the muscle, we can do more than one keyhole incision and then perform the surgery. Many of the surgeons, they don't close this, they leave it open because it is in the posterior part of the tenons. But it's better to close this with the Vicryl suture, which we usually use. So to conclude, this is the last slide. There are different type of incision of surgeon's choice, but there is no clear advantage of the incisions for squint surgery as regards complications, outcomes, and patient satisfaction. Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Dr. Rishi, for the excellent presentation. Now I invite Dr. Chandresh Parekh, sir, for his talk. Sir would be talking to us on pearls and pitfalls in squint surgery. Dr. Chandresh Parekh, sir, please.
Am I audible?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. Good morning, everyone. I thank the organizers of BOA and MOS for having invited me here today. I shall be speaking on pearls and pitfalls in the squint surgery. There is no financial disclosure. It has taken me 35 years to collect these pearls, which I'll be dividing in the pre-operative and the operative part. First, the pre-operative. The most important is that without doing the prism bar cover test of PBCT, one should not do a squint surgery. It is like doing a IOL surgery without doing the biometry. So it is very essential to do PBCT first. One should also tackle the vertical squint and obliques at the same time, because our goal is to straighten the eyes in all 9 cardinal position of gaze, and it also helps in correcting the slight under-over corrections in the horizontal squints. First, one should do the squint surgery and then ptosis. However, squint surgery should be second in case one is planning to do any refractive surgery or a cataract surgery. And one should first treat the amblyopia and then do the squint surgery, because angular squint may change after the cataract or the refractive surgery, but it should be done as soon as possible. A lot of time patients are advised to do the surgery at the time of marriage, which I don't agree with. For a general ophthalmologist, when they should not operate, that is very important. One, if the patient is less than 5 years of age, because the surgical planes are not well defined, one should not operate vertical or oblique squints. Fornix approach, as Dr. Rishik has rightly pointed out, is a difficult approach. So one needs adequate experience with other approaches, and one should avoid resurgery and restrictive surgery till one has got sufficient experience. We have to counsel the parents about their apprehension about the GA and the surgery. Informed consent is very important because the court wants an informed consent and not a consent. And in this, one has to mention all the possible modalities of squint treatment and the common side effects and a serious side effect. I even mentioned that in my informed consent. The surgery charges are equivalent in Mumbai, at least people it would be equivalent to about 1.5 lakh rupees per muscle if the surgery lasts for half an hour to 45 minutes. Now let's go to the operative part. The atropine intramuscular is very important because there is more efficacious to prevent an oculocardiac reflex rather than intravenous atropine. Asepsis is very important because in Mumbai, one of the charitable clinic, for a cosmetic squint surgery, the patient developed ENDOF and required evisceration for a cosmetic squint surgery in an adult. One should have a surgical plan readily available like the IOL power right in front of you and revise the surgical anatomy. Only operating in the ketamine without intubation not advisable because airway should be secured because ketamine causes the tongue fall and the respiratory depression. Peribulbar should be repeated if there is any pain because otherwise the patient will become uncooperative. The eye drops are very important because if you are going to operate 3 muscles in one eye, then the stickiness of the eye trap should not come out. It should be big so that one can see the sutures. The strip should be applied so that the stickiness is maintained, the eyelids are retracted, and it avoids the eyelashes coming in the field of view. The eye speculum should be with the solid plate so it keeps the eyelashes away and adjustable eye speculum. FDT should be done repeatedly for every muscle surgery to rule out any adhesions. Please remember, eyeball is suspended in the orbit. So one has to use one hand is occupied to stabilize the eyeball. So one has to use a marking ink, for example, to mark a point of insertion. And that it also helps us in reaching to the muscle because the muscle insertion or the recession goes very close to the medial and the lateral canthus. Fixation sutures should be used because the eyeball is suspended. However, the minus point is when you use the fixation sutures, the eyeball may get rotated, so your plane would get distorted. And while taking conjunctival suture, it will add to the difficulty. As Dr. Rishikesh advised, my suggestion is to do limbal approach because the scar comes on at limbus, which is the junction of two dissimilar tissues. When you hook horizontal recti, please remember to hook it from the superior side. Otherwise, especially for the lateral rectus, you'll be inadvertently hooking the inferior oblique along with it. The conjunctival separation, the muscle is very firmly attached to the conjunctiva. So when you recess a recti muscle, the conjunctiva also gets recessed. So for example, for a recession of 8 millimeter lateral rectus, one should recess the conjunctiva by about 15 millimeters from the limbus. I suggest to do sharp dissection to prevent the adhesions and not blunt dissection with the birds. One should have the tissue respect and avoid repetition of the surgery. Then only the eye will respect you as a surgeon. I use a single arm needle and I do a single pass, full thickness pass through the muscle. In a recession, one should not cut flush with the sclera because we need to hold the muscle stump to rotate the eyeball. So it should be about 1.5 millimeter from the insertion and mark with a blue dye so that your one hand is free to pass the needle. The scleral pass, one should be able to see the passage of the needle through the sclera, and I prefer a radial or a pass right angle to the limbus. And when you are tying the knot, you should rotate the eyeball back towards the muscle so then the muscle is in a proper position. And at the end of recession and resection, one should see where the center of the muscle is lying. Otherwise, you'll end up with under or overcorrection. In resection, I prefer muscle clamp because you have to pull the muscle toward the limbus, which is much easier with the muscle clamp. Remember, please, get the muscle insertion is the thinnest portion of the sclera. So again, you have to leave the muscle stump so they can pass just superficial to the sclera, so the superficial fibers of the sclera. And again, please take central sutures. Otherwise, the lagging will cause undercorrection. And whenever you are starting the conjunctiva closure in a GA, switch off the AC so that patient comes out of the GA fast. Conjunctiva closure is very important because otherwise it will lead to a poor cosmetic and parents will be unhappy with it. I don't put a patch on the eye unless there is a corneal epithelial erosion. And antiemetic is must because a lot of patients have the vomiting post squint surgery. So remember that the pulse which over 35 years I've divided into intra and operative, but I'll again repeat, if you don't have a prism bar, if you're not done the prism bars examination, there should be a bar on the surgery and one should not operate. Thank you again for a patient listening.
Thank you, Dr. Thank you, Dr. Parekh, for sharing those words of wisdom. They're very helpful, I'm sure, to all of us with for so many years' experience. Now invite Dr. Vaishali Une to give her talk on spectrums of monocular elevation deficiency. Dr. Vaishali, I think you're muted. Dr. Vaishali?
Yes. Just yeah. Yeah. Am I audible?
Yes.
Good morning, all. And at the outset, I would like to thank BOA, MOS, Lani sir, Rangini ma'am, and Hemalini ma'am, and Prachi, Dr. Prachi, for inviting me. And I'm really honored to be on this shared screen with so many stalwarts. So very good morning. And the topic is quite close to my heart. And I thank the organizers for giving me this topic. Monocular elevation deficiencies spectrum. So it is characterized by the unilateral limitation in elevation. The causes may be either paretic, restrictive, or it is a combination of both. We all know that earlier, when we were PGs, we were taught that as the name was coined by Dr. Dunlap as double elevator palsy. But now we know very well that it was a misnomer because it is not just caused by inferior oblique and superior rectus muscle palsy, but then because of the restriction element also. MED can also be associated with the Marcus-Gunn jaw winking phenomena. It is not a hereditary condition, rare, can be congenital or acquired. And the clinical features are here. I've got the pictures. Primarily, there is a large hypertropia in primary position. There is limitation in elevation in adduction as well as in abduction. If there is a ptosis, the child may have chin up, that is abnormal head posture. There is also concurrent strabismus, usually exotropia, presenting in 30 to 50% of patients. Then there can be a combination of ptosis and pseudotosis. For the postgraduate students, I would like to explain that pseudotosis is that ptosis which gets corrected after we do the cover test. So it is not a true ptosis and it doesn't need surgery. Only the cause, when you take care of the cause, then the pseudotosis gets corrected. Bell's phenomena is usually very poor in such patients, and we may have to think about while surgery, this is important to look upon. And when the eye is fixating with the normal eye, there is pseudotosis and hypertrophy of the ptotic eye, whereas when the paretic eye is taking up fixation, the normal eye takes up the hypertropia. A small video to show about the Marcus-Gunn phenomena in this MED patient with hypertropia. The child has hypertropia with ptosis, and on the jaw winking phenomena, there is. So what are the types? First is the type 1 is the restrictive, where there is primarily inferior rectus fibrosis. The patient may be orthotropic on primary gaze. The forced duction test, which is very important in MED cases, has to be done, and subsequently I'll tell you the importance. So forced duction test in this cases is positive because of the restriction of the inferior rectus, and Bell's phenomena is poor. Then the second part is paretic, where it is secondary to the superior rectus palsy. Here the force reduction test is negative, and hence why we have to know this, because the management totally depends on which type we are dealing with. And the third type usually has the supranuclear involvement, and it is a combination of both. So the management differs. Most important, like already told by the previous speakers, and as Parekh sir had also told, the cover test is, in this case, especially in MED cases, is very important, because especially I would like to tell my oculoplasty friends that if in a case of ptosis, we have to do the cover test and see whether the ptosis improves on the cover test. So this is primarily for the postgraduates that don't go the labeling, diagnosing it as just a case of ptosis. It may be a case of MED. And then the next, another important is the force reduction test. So force reduction test is done. I'm afraid the video is not. So the force reduction test is by holding at the limbus and moving towards the action of the muscles. And if there is limitation or you get restricted movements, you get label it as force reduction test positive and or negative. Again, there is another important test, that is the force generation test, where we ask the patient to, the eyes is held, but the patient is asked to move in the direction of the muscle, and a tug if it is present, or if it is absent, that way accordingly we know the power, again to differentiate between the paretic and the restrictive pharmacodots. Coming to the differential diagnosis, Brown syndrome is very close, because it is elevation, defective elevation in adduction, but here in MED, there is elevation in adduction and limited elevation in adduction as well as in abduction. Inferior oblique palsy is also one of the differential diagnoses. The hypotropia would increase on the ipsilateral head tail. Blowout fractures commonly seen in casualty areas when there is tissue entrapment. So in those cases, force reduction test is positive. And superior oblique overaction, we get typically A pattern exotropia. In congenital fibrosis syndrome, we have, it is bilateral, congenital, and all the muscles are involved. Hence, along with the elevation deficiency, we have limited abduction and adduction also, but there is ptosis also. So it also comes very near to MED, to get confused, and the adherence syndromes. So management, like I have just told initially, that it is primarily surgery. The type of surgery depends on the cause of elevation deficit, and if the child is having amblyopia, also we need to repair the ptosis also and correct the squint surgery. Like the previous speaker said, there is no hurry, squint just to do the, in this case, I would say that there's no hurry to do the ptosis surgery. Find out whether the underlying squint is there. If the squint corrects your ptosis, then we need not go further. So
we have a minute.
Okay, okay. So it's just about if FDT is positive. Usually in the inferior rectus recession helps the pseudotosis also. If not, then when it is FDT is negative, we need to have that NAPS procedure. I'll just go on to the NAPS procedure, where the medial and lateral recti are sutured at the superior rectus border. Then there is an augmented NAP procedure, that is conventional NAP with the posterior fixation sutures. There is a modified also, where only the superior half of the medial and lateral recti are given sutured near the superior rectus. So after doing a primary surgery, we may have to deal with the element of true ptosis. So if LPS action is absent, a sling surgery is done. If it is associated with Marcus gun ptosis, a crutch spectacle can be used for our disinsertion of LPS and followed by sling surgery. So the take-home message is, in all cases of ptosis, examine the eye for evidence of hypotropia. Do cover test. I keep on saying this to my residents, that always do cover test and look for improvement in ptosis. Next is that see for in detail for the extraocular muscle movements. That will give you a lot hint about what kind of squint you are going to look at. And forced duction test is important in planning the surgical options. So I'm very sorry I couldn't have the videos of my surgical. I just could put the photographs. So thank you for patiently listening, and thank you again for giving me this opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am, for the excellent talk, especially highlighting the importance to rule out pseudotosis and to look for the differential diagnosis. Now I invite Dr. Sandra Ganesh, who is the senior consultant at Aravind Eye Hospital, Coimbatore, for her talk on interesting cases in superior oblique palsy. Dr. Sandra, please.
Good morning, everybody. Yes. Thank you for being there. Thank you so much. Good morning.
Good morning. Are you able to hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yes. So many thanks to the Bombay Ophthalmic Association and the Maharashtra Ophthalmic Association for this kind invite, and especially Dr. Prachi for her very personal invitation. So today I'll be talking about interesting case scenarios in superior oblique palsy. So superior oblique palsy is the most common form of vertical strabismus, though the management is challenging due to the wide range of operative and intraoperative considerations. The choice of procedure depends on various factors like the amount of hypertropia in primary gaze, bilaterality, torsion, occupational and functional needs of the patient. And so I'll be illustrating this with the help of a few case examples. The first is that of a 24-year-old male with a sudden onset of binocular diplopia. There is no trauma. The best corrected vision is 6/6 with the anterior segment and fundus evaluation being normal. And as you can see in this picture, he has around 25 PD of R/L in the primary gaze, and that increases in the left gaze and the right tilt. So the diagnosis is quite straightforward, being that of a right superior oblique palsy. He did not have binocular single vision. This is a case of a congenital right superior oblique palsy because, and why does he present later? It's mainly because they lose the vertical fusion amplitudes later on, and hence they present later with the diplopia. So the intraoperative forced duction, there is no tension or laxity. Hence we did only a recession of the right inferior oblique muscle. So post-operatively, he was able to fuse the residual 10 PD of R/L that he had in the primary gaze, and that near deviation was only 2. So it was good that we did not go ahead with the 2 muscle surgery in this patient, because then we can expect a reversal of the diplopia. The second patient is that of a 34-year-old male, complained of squinting of the right eye since childhood, and history of road traffic accidents in 2008, where he had undergone a surgery for a facial bone fracture. He did not have an anomalous head posture. There is a right hyper again. And this is his motility, showing the huge right inferior oblique overaction and the right superior oblique underaction. And you can see here again the huge 50 PD of right R/L increasing in the left gaze and the right tilt, as you can see in the 9 gaze photographs also. So here it is. And this again, the trauma was misleading. He did not have an acquired SO palsy component at all. It is a congenital SO palsy presenting late again. And so we did an intraoperative forced duction test for the superior oblique. It was extremely lax. And I usually prefer a nasal approach for the superior oblique tendon. You can see how long and lax it is. So the diagnosis of the congenital SO palsy here is confirmed. So I'm doing a tuck here, and usually prefer to do an adjustable tuck where you put in the slip knot and then you titrate the amount of tightness that you want. As you can see here, is much tighter before than like after doing the tuck than it was before. You can compare the amount of cornea that goes into the nasal supranasal aspect, and so the tuck is done here. We also combined it with the inferior oblique antero positioning due to the huge hyper, and at the end of 2 muscles you can see that the R/L is 16 PD here, increasing in the left gaze again and the right tilt, but the patient was quite happy. We did tell him that if he wanted further correction, then we will be operating on the other eye inferior rectus here, so that will be the 3rd muscle of choice. Currently, he is quite happy with the result right now and said he'll come back if needed for the 2nd procedure. So the 3rd patient, again, he complained of upward deviation in his right eye since early childhood. He had a need to use the chin up posture in both eyes to fuse, and he could fuse only in his down gaze. The unaided visual acuity was 6/6 with the anterior segment and fundus evaluation being normal. You can see here with his right eye fixing, the left eye goes completely up with an upshoot, whereas with the left eye fixing, the right eye is down and it has a ptosis also. And he has a BSV with the chin up posture, could fuse very well in the down gaze. You can see here the extraocular motility, a huge upshoot and on both primary and elevation, normal superior oblique function, and could fuse in down gaze. So here, this is his 9 gaze photographs. Again, you can see the same picture with the upshoot in both the primary and the up gazes. All gazes having an exotropia. Exotropia increasing towards the left side, and also exotropia only present in down gaze with no vertical. And this is the fundus picture with the extorsion in both eyes. So this was quite of a, like a diagnostic dilemma. We were thinking between right eye MED, left eye SO palsy or misinnervation. So the plan was to go ahead and explore intraoperatively to get some clues intraoperatively also. And you can see the superior rectus being hooked and the superior oblique by the nasal approach, again extremely long and lax. So that was in favor of a congenital SO palsy. The superior rectus was also, there was a mild tightness. So maybe a long-standing SO palsy with an SR, a mild contracture. So here I'm doing a tuck of 6 mm using the non-absorbable suture. And the superior rectus was also recessed here because we were not sure whether there is a misinnervation going on, and extreme upshoot in the up gaze. And this is the lateral rectus and the inferior here. So because the upshoot was so much, I decided on doing an anterior nasal transposition of the inferior oblique, where the inferior oblique goes under the inferior rectus and being attached. So I did that because I wanted a stronger depressing force, and the lateral rectus is also being recessed by 8 millimeters. So you can see the post-operative, we were very happy to see the good outcome here. You can see the absence, total absence of upshoot in the up cases. Primary alignment is very good, and in the gaze position also there is no upshoot, and down gaze he continues to maintain the alignment. He no longer needed the chin up posture, and he could fuse in most of his gazes. So again, this is a case of SO palsy, though with a very different presentation. The last, another case is that of a road traffic accident, head injury, underwent conservative neurological management, but noticed double vision in down gaze for the past 4 months. He was working in a textile industry and could not resume work because of diplopia. And here you can see that it is like a bilateral superior oblique palsy with a mild esotropia in primary, but on the down gaze, he had a huge ET and also a vertical deviation. So this patient could not use his down gaze at all, and he couldn't join work. This is the fundus examination with 20-degree extorsion seen in both eyes, though the extorsion subjective was more in the left eye. So the main concerns were chin depression, torsion, and diplopia in down gaze. So it's a case of acquired SO palsy. The surgery done was inferior recession of 4 millimeter with a mild temporal transposition for the esotropia and left eye superior oblique candidiato. So this is the photographs of the surgery with the temporal transposition of the inferior oblique after recession, as you can see here. And this is the superior oblique anterior transposition with the Harada Ito. So post-operatively, he did not have ET in primary. Down gaze esotropia collapsed from 20 to 6. So he had a much bigger binocular field of vision right now, and he could resume joining his work. And this is the fundus picture. As you can see, there is a mild overcorrection with a slight intorsion of his left eye, where we did the Harada Ito. Right eye also reverts to normal. So sometimes even one surgery can give, one eye Harada Ito gives a good result. And the last case is a 38-year-old lady.
Dr. Sandra,
Yes, just finishing. The head injury, 1.5 years earlier, noticed double vision in down gaze on climbing the stairs, and she had to tilt her head. And she had a huge vertical with 12 prisms L over R in the left gaze and increasing in the down gaze and towards the right side and the left tilt. So again, it's acquired left SO palsy, but the good thing is she did not have much, she did not have torsion. So because it was more in the down gaze, So I decided on doing the other eye inferior rectus with a resect recess procedure or a Scott's procedure. And so with that, her primary was okay. Down gaze, the L by R reduced to 6 prism from 12 prism. So her binocular field increased and she did not have diplopia except for extreme down gaze. So to conclude, single muscle surgery may be the standard for smaller amount of hypertropia. Ipsilateral inferior oblique weakening is one of the choices. Contralateral inferior rectus and SO tucking if FTT shows SO laxity. Harada Ito for torsion. And if the angle is more than 15, 2 muscles. And usually if there is SO tendon laxity, I prefer to combine the inferior oblique along with the ipsilateral superior oblique. And that avoids GA in adults if the surgery is performed only on one eye. And you can avoid intra-operative like iatrogenic browns if you do an adjustable tuck and judge the tightness based on the amount of tightness that you want. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Sandra, for such a lovely illustrative demonstration of the spectrum of cases of superior oblique palsy. Now I invite Dr. Sanathan Gopal to speak on the looking beyond occlusion. He is an innovator, and let us see how he is sharing his new knowledge with us. Thank you.
I would also take this opportunity to invite Dr. Prabhakar Patil, sir, who has joined us. Welcome, sir. Welcome to the session.
Santan, sir, you're muted, sir. So we're not able to hear you.
Yeah. Can you hear me now?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Yes.
Good morning. I thank the Bombay Ophthalmic Association for this opportunity to present my instrument, which is called as the Orthoptic, and which is called as Orthoptic. This talk is divided into 3 parts. The first part is about just the presentation of the instrument, and also how to use the instrument, which is very easy. Even the illiterate patients can use it. The second part of it is to show you the results using this machine on over 142 patients. And the third part, which is the most difficult part to understand and not needed for an average general ophthalmologist or even for that matter, a strabismologist to know. So let us start with the first part. This is called as a magnocellular stimulator, which is used for not only treatment of amblyopia, but a number of other conditions. And after using this instrument, I've seen improvement in stereopsis, binocular vision, monocular vision, and in a large percentage of the patients with exotropia, intermittent divergent squint, and also in consecutive exotropias, they never needed further surgery. And this improvement in all these conditions is sustained even after we stop the treatment for about 6 months after the last session. The stereopsis improved much faster than the monocular vision, and binocular single vision in all these patients for distance improved rapidly. So the instrument, to show you, has got three, in the instrument has three rows of light, 9 rows of light, or 3 rows of 3 lights. The center one is red in color, and the patient sit about 1 meter in front of the machine, and the eye level is adjusted for the red light. And the patient with a laser pointer keeps pointing at this light which comes on, which stays for 300 milliseconds, and the next light comes on. Like that, the process goes on for about 25 minutes or 20 minutes with the amblyopic eye, and the other eye is passed during the time, and then it is done with both the eyes for about 5 to 10 minutes, and then it's done with normal eye for about 5 minutes. And this constitutes a session of about 30 to 40 minutes, depending on the degree of amblyopia. And you can repeat the same within 1 day, 2 or 3 times, but patients usually lose attention because our machine is based essentially on attention mechanism, which you will know later. We cannot do more than 3 sessions in 1 day. That's about how to use the machine. Now, during the time when you are not using doing any exercise, there is no need to patch the eye. So our results I will present. Binocular single vision at presentation. You can see that none of the amblyopics had any binocular vision for distance with redundant glasses. But you can see here, after treatment, nearly 95% had binocular single vision within the first 3 or 4 days of the treatment, and all the suppression disappeared. The initial visual acuity in these patients, you can see 0.493 and 0.210, and after treatment, you can see 0.08 and 0.07 in amblyopia patients. The initial stereopsis in all these patients present at all. To give a number in considering the statistical part of it, so we gave the number 3000 seconds of arc, which is the lowest possible stereopsis. And this is after treatment. You can see about 10 days of treatment, 45.4 in the anisometropic amblyopia, and 216 stereopsis in strabismus. Some of them need some surgery. Now, in order to explain why this machine works and why it works so rapidly, you need to know a lot about these things, the whole visual pathway. But I don't have enough time to discuss all these things. Just to say one few points here, that the first place where the photochemical energy, photonic energy is converted into neural energy is at the ganglion cell layer, which are of various types. The parvocellular types, the coniocellular and the magnocellular, and they all go to LGN first, and then they go to the V1, which is the lowest visual cortex. At the V1, the ganglion cells go to different layers in V1, depending on what type they are, 4A, 4B, and 4C. In the 4C, 4C alpha, and 4C beta. Let's not go into the details. The sensory cortex in turn is closely connected to the motor cortex in a very orderly fashion, which is called as foveo-cortical fidelity, which means that the point above the fovea or point below the fovea or nasal or temporal is exactly represented in the cortex, which the retinal topography is exactly represented in the cortex. And during a saccadic movement, you must remember that the retina between the fovea and the stimulated peripheral retinal point is suppressed by the brain during a saccade. There are various types of saccades, but what we are interested in is called as the reflexive saccade or prosaccades. So at the beginning, before the prosaccade starts, the fovea is already alerted, and after the saccade stops, the fovea is still active. So therefore, this is possible because there is a connection between the M and P cells throughout in the brain at various levels. This is the principle we exploit in this machine. We can see that the retina magnocellular cells are catered to the peripheral retina, and they go to only ventral 1 and 2 of LGN, whereas parvocellular cells catered to the central retina have a larger representation in the sensory cortex and also in LGN, 3, 4, 5, 6, the dorsal part of the LGN. Now, LGN is not a simple relay station. It's only 30% of the impulses that come to LGN are passed on to the cortex after modification. And this modification at LGN happens because of this corticogeniculate modulating fibers which come down from V1 to LGN, and perhaps they go down to retinal level also. So you can see that the parvocellular cells go to layer 4C beta in V1, whereas the magnocellular cells go to 4C alpha in V1. From there, they again diverge. The parvocellular cells mainly go to the infratemporal cortex or what of vision, whereas the magnocellular cells go to the where of vision, which is the superoparietal cortex. Now, this division of labor is very, very essential in central nervous system for uniformly sending the impulses and managing the impulses very correctly. So there is a lot of interconnection between the M and P cells. Ultimately, both an M and P cells end up in the primary posterior parietal cortex, which is called as the global sensory motor integration center. So you can see that the primary parietal cortex is the global integration center, which receives both the parvocellular and magnocellular cells discharge. In the parietal cortex, there are two centers which are called the attention center and the saccadic generation center, and they are in connection with each other. And when the attention center is strongly stimulated, the saccadic generation center is strongly inhibited. And when the saccadic generation center is strongly stimulated, the attention area is slightly depressed. So as I told you, it's called as PPC is called as Global Sensory Motor Integration Center, which receives all the afferent impulses from all the parts of the body and decides what motor action should be taken after taking into consideration all the afferent stimuli. Now, in the PPC, as I told you, there are attention area and saccadic generation area. The attention area sends down the impulses not only to different parts of the cortex, but also to V1. And these impulses which come from attention area are called as the top-down impulses. They can be recognized on EEG as alpha and beta oscillations. They go to layer V1 at layer 4C beta, and the top-down impulses from the saccadic generation area go to the attention area, and then they come down to layer 4C beta. Also, the forward connection with the saccadic generation center is to the frontal eye field area, which is very closely situated to the hand area in the brain. And therefore, I give a laser pointer to improve the hand-eye coordination in many of these patients, which is abnormal in amblyopia. So the point is, peripheral retinal point, when it is stimulated, M cells get stimulated by the sudden appearance of the light, and the eyes make a saccadic movement. When the eyes make a saccadic movement, the direction and the amount of which is dependent on the distance of the peripherally stimulated point from the fovea. Due to the foveo-cortical fidelity, the eye moves. When the eye moves to such extent so that the...
You have a minute, sir, please.
So that the fovea is brought to focus. Farther away from the fovea, the point is, the greater is the movement, and closer to the fovea, the less is the movement, and at the fovea, there is no movement of the eye because of strong inhibition of the saccadic generation center. So the principle is sudden appearance of light in the peripheral retina, then followed by stimulation of saccadic eye movement, is then associated with the stimulation of the fovea in V1 at 4C beta via the top-down impulses which come from attention center in the parietal area to the occipital area, and suppression of the retinal area happens in between these two as alluded to earlier. So repeated stimulation of the magnocellular cells leads to repeated stimulation of the attention area in the parietal cortex, which in turn stimulates the fovea, which in turn improves the vision. The prosaccade is associated with maximum stimulation of the V1. Now, all this can be understood because the top-down impulses which come down from the parietal cells go to 4C beta, where the suppression is maximum. However, it's important to note that the top-down impulses on 4C beta go to not only the synapses, before synapse and after the synapse also, so that it obviates the suppression which is situated at the 4C beta synapse level. So when you say amblyopia, there is suppression, you should ask, where is the suppression? A general answer is in the cortex. Where in cortex? In the occipital cortex. Where in occipital cortex? You see, when you go and analyze, you realize that the maximum suppression happens at level 4C beta synapses. The afferent impulses from the parvocellular cells go to 4C beta. So if the suppression is in the synapse, no information is passed on to the extrastriate cortex for further analysis by the occipital cortex, and therefore there is no analysis of the image. The occipital cortex is called as image forwarding center. It does not do anything. It does not really analyze the images, but it passes off the image quality. It passes off the information about the color, texture, shape, and size of the images to the extrastriate areas, which are principal in analyzing this information. Whereas our magnocellular cells pass on the information.
Dr. Santhan sir, please summarize.
Finished?
Yes.
Finished?
No, I didn't understand.
Sir, please summarize. Conclude.
We have 1 minute.
Okay. Anyway, I'm almost finished. The top-down impulses which come from the parietal cells go beyond the synapse where the suppression is in amblyopia, and therefore the vision in amblyopia improves. No matter how much you send impulses from the retina to the cortex, it is not going to go beyond suppression point at 4C beta, which is the synapse at 4C beta. However, the top-down impulses have not only discharge before the synapse, but in the synapse and also after the synapse. And therefore, this instrument is very useful in many cases of attention deficit disorders cerebral palsy, amblyopia, nystagmus, and in most cases of exotropias, which don't need any further surgery. Thank you very much. I think I had 10 minutes. Subhash didn't note that. So,
so you have taken 11 minutes, sir.
Oh, sorry. Finished. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Now I invite Dr. Shashikant Shetty, who is Chief of Pediatric Ophthalmology at Arvind Eye Hospital, Madurai, to give his talk, please, on surgical management of nystagmus. Dr. Shashikant Shetty, please.
Yeah, I can't share my screen.
Now you'll be able to.
Yes, sir, we can see your screen now.
Okay. Yeah. Good morning, BOA, MOA, for inviting me for this very excellent webinar. I would like to thank Dr. Hema Malini Sawant and Dr. Prachi for personally inviting me for this webinar. I'll be talking on basic aspects, surgical aspects of patients with nystagmus. So there's no financial disclosures. So this is the slide given by Dr. Del Hosso. He just illustrates how a patient with nystagmus sees. So basically they have a very small zone of visual acuity with a null point that is called as a null point. So when he has a null point, he sees at a point where he sees clearly. And when the null point shifts, the other zones are blurred. And so you can see in this slide how there's a small zone of narrow visual acuity. So when we do the surgery for these patients, we expect the null to be here from the periphery, but actually what happens, there is a widening of the null zone. So patient actually sees better. So which group we need to operate? If the any age group, specific age group, yeah, actually we wait for the head posture to stabilize, because sometimes patient can have alternating head postures. Patient can have periodic alternating nystagmus, and they might have a silent null. So suppose one null gets corrected, the second patient may start using the second null. Or if the patient has got significant head postures, we should have a periodic assessment of the head postures to rule out pan, A-pan, and a silent null. And then if you have access to eye movement recordings, we should do recordings to look for, again, pan, look for NAFX, and finally look for reversal to rule out aperiodic alternating nystagmus. And if you not have access to eye movement recordings, then we can do vision in 9 gazes. This 9 gazes vision recording helps a lot. It tells you if there is associated 2 nulls or there is a single null. So what we see here, this is a chrome. This is a cervical range of ocular motion, what we use in our clinic to assess the head posture. It can assess head posture in all the 3 gazes. The horizontal. This is for the chin elevation, for the head tilt. And this is for the chin elevation or the chin depression. So it assesses the head posture in all the 3 gazes. The horizontal, this is for the chin elevation, and this is for the head tilt. So all the 3 gazes can be seen. And we do eye movement recordings for everyone. We use the iLink 1000+, which is a very great machine, which can evaluate even in this child who is 1.5 years old and it's got a upbeating nystagmus. We use the eye tracker, which is nothing but an infrared lace light, which analyzes the eye movement, and it tracks the pupil as well as the cornea. And then you can see the movements of the eye, and you can look for A-pan, pan. You can look for subtle seesaw nystagmus. And then you can see this, we can analyze both the vertical component as well as the horizontal component. So these are the waveforms which we can use to see the type of nystagmus, like a pendular, asymmetric pendular, pendular with foveating saccade, jerk right with extended foveation, pseudo-cycloid, pseudo-jerk left, pure pendular foveating saccade, triangular, bidirectional jerk, and directional jerk. These are the different waveforms we can look at. These bidirectional jerk forms are seen in the neutral zone. Neutral zone is nothing but away from the null zone, where there is a direction of the nystagmus will change. Okay, So if you're analyzing more than 30 degrees, you go to 45 degrees, 60 degrees, then you can look for bidirectional jug waveforms. Before you assess the head posture, you have to assess the head posture. You have to look for PAN, A-PAN. Periodic alternating nystagmus is basically seen in adults, and they are switch at regular intervals. While in pediatric patients, you will usually see a aperiodic alternating nystagmus. So you have to observe for a long period of time, because patient might have a right face turn, and then over a 10 minutes of time, he might switch over to left face turn in patients with aperiodic alternating nystagmus. But in patients with periodic alternating nystagmus, you might have a change of reversal every 90 minutes. 10 minutes, there may be a null phase, and then it will go reverse to and from right beat to left beat. And when we are assessing head posture, you can use the yoke prisms. You can keep the prisms and then see whether the head posture reverses. So when you correct one head posture, patient may go to another head posture. Then you are sure that patient might be having a periodic alternating nystagmus. And second thing is, if the patient has got a multiplanar nystagmus, if the patient has got a multiplanar nystagmus, where patient can have associated head tilt, chin elevation, face turn. So then if you correct only one posture, you keep the prisms, correct the dominant head posture and see what happens to the other head postures. If they get corrected, that suggests that if you do surgery only for the dominant head posture, it will increase the null zone. It will cause widening of the null zone, and the other head postures will get corrected by itself. This is a study which we did for Kestenbaum-Anderson's procedure. Kestenbaum-Anderson's procedure usually correct up to 10 to 15 degree. If it is more than that, then you need to augment. This was an immediate post of surprise what we got after doing a augmented Anderson's-Kestenbaum procedure for a 25 degree face turn. Patient developed large angle esotropia in the primary position and developed double vision. And then over a period of time, the movements got better. You can still see the limitation of movements where there was a maximum recession was done. In conclusion, we had residual face turns of 5 degree in patients where patients underwent augmented Kestenbaum's head posture. There was limitation of gazes was not very significant, and we got a 1.5 degree millimeter improvement in all these patients. This is a small video where we had a patient who had a right face turn, and patient had a left eye esotropia. And he had a small esotropia with alternating suppression, and he was dominant actually with the right eye. So we decided to do right eye medial rectus recession and lateral rectus resection. And then on the first post-op day, immediately developed a reversal of the face turn, started fixing with his left eye. And 2 weeks later, we saw him again. And then he has gone back to his original head posture of a right face turn. So you might see a reversal of face turn if the patient has got a periodic alternating nystagmus or aperiodic alternating nystagmus, or if there's a silent null, or if they have a fusion maldevelopment nystagmus. So in our experience, we feel that rectus muscle recession with oblique surgeries, if the patient has got a head posture of vertical head posture of 20 degree, it helps. If it is more than 20 to 30, we do a recess resect posture of the vertical recti. If it is more than 40 degree, then we do a 8 mm recess resect. This is a patient who had a chin elevation of 30 degree, and we use the prisms to neutralize his head posture. Very small amplitude nystagmus. And we proceeded with 5 mm recession, and because the patient had a chin up, so recess his inferior rectus, and we resected his superior rectus. And there was a good improvement in his chin posture.
Sir, we have 1 minute.
And if you have a chin down, you can proceed with the superior rectus recession with infraoblique myectomy, which takes care of the pattern with the recession of the superior rectus. And also it can, because when you do the superior rectus recess, it can induce exudation in the primary position. And by doing combining with the inferior oblique, which might induce a small ESO, so that takes care of the horizontal deviation also. And with the head tilt, this child had a head tilt to the right side. So basically we need to take care of the intorsion in the right eye, extort the right eye and intort the left eye. And he had a very small amplitude nystagmus. We did an MRI to rule out the contracture of the sternocleidomastoid muscle. So what we did is we weakened the extorsion in the left eye. We weakened this inferior oblique anterior fibers by 8 millimeters, and we did a Harald-Ito procedure in the left eye. And in the right eye, what we did is we did the anterior superior oblique tenectomy, and we did a anterior advancement of the anterior fibers of the inferior oblique. And we created a required extorsion in the right eye, and we created a required intorsion in the left eye. But in spite of which, the patient still maintained the right eye head posture. So in spite of doing such a large procedure, the head posture was still, you can see the small amplitude nystagmus on the right head tilt. And as soon as he tilted his head to the left side, the nystagmus actually increased.
Sir, would request you to please summarize.
Yeah, so this is a patient, when we do the eye movement recordings, we have to look for pan. This is a left beating nystagmus, and this is a right beating nystagmus. Okay, so when you do eye movement recordings, which is very important, you can rule out periodic alternating nystagmus. And this is a patient who had the periodic alternating nystagmus, but he didn't have face turn, but he had a chin elevation. And after the chin elevation, we are seeing only the right beat nystagmus. And we have to be very careful when you see a patient nystagmus. You have to rule out saccadic oscillations and saccadic intrusions. So this is a patient who had square wave jerks. It looked like a nystagmus, but on eye movement recordings, we could rule out saccadic intrusion. So to be very, very careful, because saccadic intrusions can be in supranuclear gaze palsies. It can be seen in patients with myasthenia. So you have to rule out saccadic. You should not operate those patients. They are basically saccadic intrusion. They don't have slow phase. They only have saccades. So this is a patient, you can see the saccadic intrusions. So there are multiple saccadic intrusions, saccadic wave oscillations, which can be ruled out with eye movement recordings. So when we do the surgery for this patient, what exactly you're doing?
Dr. Sasikant, please conclude.
Expanded null gaze. So you're improving the null gaze. You're not improving the vision. Subjective vision will remain the same. You're improving the time to see. You're improving the time to see, so you improve his contrast. You improve his gaze-dependent visual acuity and other parameters of visual acuity. So the vision might remain the same when you check his vision, but his other parameters.
Dr. Shetty.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you so much, everyone. I request Dr. Dedia, sir, to kindly share his inputs, please.
Basically, if there are any questions, we are left with only 2 minutes. So that box, they can be put to the speakers.
Raj, sir, would you please like to add your comments?
Yeah, it was a wonderful. Am I audible?
Yes, yes. Dr. Shanbag, please mute yourself. Dr. Shanbag, please mute yourself.
Yeah. Am I audible?
Yes.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, it was a wonderful session. First of all, let me thank BOA, MOS, and the panel for the invite. It was a really wonderful session. Each one of the speakers gave some take-home messages for the general ophthalmologists. And I think overall, we could gather some good points to practice in. So thank you for the invite.
Dr. Praveena, ma'am, please.
Yes, I have a question for topical anesthesia. That subject was anytime he just changed the type of anesthesia at the time of surgery. Did they need to change the sort of anesthesia topical to different anesthesia during the surgery?
Actually, ma'am, I'm doing this since last 10 years and not great number of cases I had done under topical anesthesia, but whatsoever I had done like 25 around, I never needed to change the type of anesthesia. The actually case selection is very important. Preoperatively itself, you should see whether the patient in case would be able to cooperate well, and vocal local is very important. So if you go on doing this vocal local and assuring patient, usually you don't need to change, because I usually do it for recessions and lateral and medial recti. So touch wood, I haven't needed to change my anesthesia anytime.
And there is one more question. What are the fasting instructions? I mean, you give any fasting instructions in case you need to change it in between?
Routine, like 2 hours pre-op, I tell them to keep NBM.
Okay.
Can
I add?
One question again regarding the incision in squint surgery. That basically the limbal incisions are better for the starters or the beginners, because conjunctiva and the tenons, they are together over there. So dissection becomes a little bit easier process for them. So directly switching on to the paralimbal or a fornicial, it is always better to go for a limbal incision for beginners, I believe so.
Yes, madam. Actually, we started with limbal incision only during our fellowship. So later on, we switched over to fornicial.
Right. True.
There's a question for Dr. Chandresh Parekh, sir. Like, what special precautions to be taken in the eyes which have undergone buckling? Sometimes after buckling, we see the squints. If we are operating in those eyes, what special precautions we need to take?
First of all, one is to ask the retinal surgeon whether the buckle can be removed or not. Most of the time, they don't allow the buckle to be removed. But if they permit the buckle removal, then buckle removal should be done. The other thing is that while isolating the muscle, one has to be very careful. There will be a lot of adhesions over there. So one should avoid damaging the muscle or the conjunctiva. And one should, very important, is do post-reduction tests before opening the conjunctiva, after reattaching the muscle, and before closing the conjunctiva, because there are also a lot of adhesions over there. And one may have to do semi-hangback recession, because the buckle may come in the way of passing the needle. So these are the few precautions which I take in a post-buccal squint surgery.
Thank you, sir. I welcome Dr. Lahane, sir, who has just joined us. I would request Dr. Prabhakar Patil, sir, if he would like to give some comments.
Can I have a comment, ma'am?
Yes, sir, please.
Yeah. So first of all, I think it's a good take-home message and one practical tip by Dr. Chandresh, that especially towards the end of the surgery, the AC in the room should be off, because many of the times we have observed, most of the time the temperature is between say 18 or 16, and when the child is out, he is in hypothermia. So it's a very good point that the AC should be off. Second comment is about the anesthesia. Yes, Dr. Uday Naik, I think has very well covered that, but I think the patient selection is of utmost importance. You come to know the psyche of the patient beforehand only, and only those patients who you feel that will be cooperated should be posted for topical. And on table, you should keep a local anesthesia with subtenon anesthesia ready. And for general, the squint surgery under general anesthesia, I prefer to have a blended anesthesia, because oculocardiac reflex is quite ubiquitous and quite common as than what we think. So even if the patient is under general anesthesia, it's always a good habit to give a peribulbar or a subtenon anesthesia to the child, even if he's under general anesthesia, because it has got multiple advantages. It decreases the PONV or postoperative nausea and vomiting. The amount of anesthetic gases required is also very less. The recovery is faster, and as well as there is post-op analgesia also. So it's always a good idea to have blended anesthesia, especially the squint surgery under general anesthesia. So these were a few comments.
Thank you, sir.
We have a question regarding to Dr. Sondra, that did she apply NAPS classification while operating over the superior oblique muscle?
Yeah, mostly it is according to that. Basically, I choose the procedure depending upon the amount of hypertropia in primary position and which case the hypertropia is maximum. So those are the two. And again, whether there is torsion or not. So mostly it is according to those guidelines, but also it differs a little bit based on case-to-case basis also.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, everyone. We have overshot our time by a few minutes. I would like to thank all the panelists, the chairperson, co-chairperson, and the speakers for contributing today for this wonderful session on strabismus.